other video for week 1. This video is an introduction to globalization. How do we define globalization? So Manfred Steger defines it as intensifying planetary interconnectivity. That's a mouthful, right? And Bryant Myers sees it as emergent, highly ambiguous, complex, adaptive systems. So both of them see it as dynamic, that this global interconnection that is globalization is not fixed, but expanding, stretching, multiplying, accelerating, and intensifying. So, woo! Bryant Myers, in his definition, adds this understanding that this global interconnection is a system. It's a complex, adaptive system, and it's a highly ambiguous system, that it has positive aspects and negative aspects. Bryant uses the word family, and Manfred uses the word matrix, but they both talk about processes that lead to a consciousness and a condition. And these are economic processes, political processes, and cultural processes. They are all about connection, but they are also about the ongoing connection that we call relationship. And the reason why we have the little picture of the elephant is, as you will discover in this course, there are a highly divergent range of perspectives on what globalization is and how we evaluate it. And so, of course, that's the little story of the blind people trying to decide what an elephant is. And one of them thinks an elephant is a trunk, and another one thinks an elephant is a tail. So I want to share with you some of Steger's vocabulary, because it's vocabulary that you will run into again and again throughout the course. So when he talks about globalization as a process, he says that that process leads to a global imaginary, which is this consciousness of the world as a whole. That when you don't think of the world, when you think of the world, you no longer just think of your local universe. You are conscious of the impacts of your local universe on the globe and of the globe on your local universe. Globalization as a process also leads to the emerging condition of globality, which is a tight economic, political, cultural, and environmental set of interconnections and flows. And then he talks about different forms of globalization. There is embodied globalization. So migrants embody this impact of the globe on a local place as they carry their culture from one place to another, and often back again, or living in both at the same time transnationally. It's also disembodied, that the digital reality is a disembodied reality. It is object extended, by which he means trade, so that it is through the exchange of objects that globalization occurs. And it is organization extended, that it happens through interactions between international and national institutions. Why does all this matter to us? It's huge, right? Why does it matter to us, particularly as Christians? Well, there was a little book that was very popular when I was young that was entitled, "Your God is Too Small." And I think we know that the God is the Lord of the whole universe. But if we take that really seriously, then this big picture is more important to us, because it's important to our God. In Psalm 24, verse 1, we read that the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. If it matters to him, it matters to us. Secondly, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 28, human beings are referred to as being in the image of God. And then we are told, we are given a commandment. And that commandment was never taken back. Even though the fall occurred, the commandment is still with us. It's still at the core of the purpose of our lives. And the commandment was to fill the earth and subdue it, to rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and every living creature that moves on the ground. And when you delve into the Hebrew, what you understand is that this is not a command to rule with an iron fist, that this is a call to tend the whole earth so that it will flourish. So this is our call to enable the flourishing of the whole world. And of course, one way to understand that is in relationship to Jesus' promise in John 10:10, that he has come that we may have life and have it to the full, have it abundantly. So it is at the core of our purpose as Christians to be about abundant life for all. So we can't just be aware of the whole world. We really have to be about the flourishing of the whole world. We have to be about abundant life for the whole world. And Luke 10, chapter 10, 25 through 37, the story of the Good Samaritan brings that home to us. That the story of the Good Samaritan, and I think we all know it, so I'm not taking us through it, but it culminates in the question, who is my neighbor? Right? That is the question that, it culminates in the answer to the question, who is my neighbor? It begins with the question, who is my neighbor? And then it culminates in the answer to that question. And the essential answer to that question in the Good Samaritan, when Jesus says, the one who had mercy on him, is that your neighbor could be anyone that you have the opportunity to bless. That anyone is your potential neighbor. And if someone is in your path and you have the opportunity to bless them, they become your neighbor. So in a world that is globally interconnected, the implications of that parable are extremely powerful, because there is some way in which the child dying unnecessarily of the lack of a vaccination under 5 years old in Africa is in some real sense your neighbor. And of course, we're not just concerned in general about our neighbors. In Proverbs 21, verse 13, we see a verse, which is actually one of about somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 verses that talk about our responsibility to the poor. I just happen to love this because it's so succinct and so powerful. He who closes his eyes to the cry of the poor will also cry out and not be answered. So we have this call not only to care about the whole world, because God cares about the whole world and it all belongs to him. We're not only called to the flourishing of the whole world so that all will have abundant life. We're not only called to respond actively to any opportunity we have to bless someone else, but we're also called very particularly to the poor. Of course, I don't want to stop this section without talking about Matthew 28, verses 19 through 20, where Jesus, the resurrected Christ, commands his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations, because we are never only about the physical needs of others, that true flourishing is holistic, that it is physical and it is spiritual. And we believe as Christians that there is no fullness of spiritual flourishing apart from a relationship with Jesus. So I want to leave you with a couple of sets of questions that as you work on defining globalization this week, and as you work on globalization this whole quarter, that you keep these questions in mind, that you let them sit in the back of your mind and inform your thinking. So these are Dr. Meyer's questions, and I'm going to give you some of my questions. So Dr. Myers asks, will we engage globalization as a mixture of God's grace and human sin, and question its promise of a particular kind of better human future by offering a more complete version of human flourishing as understood from Scripture? So how do we understand globalization from the biblical picture of salvation history? What does that tell us about globalization? Number 2, are we willing to call out and attempt to change the darker aspects of globalization? So we will be examining both the positive and negative aspects of globalization. Are we willing to act on that? Number 3, will the church decide to engage globalization missionally and work to shape it ethically? So it's not just what are we willing to do as individuals. What do we believe that the church should be about? And what are we willing to do to help it to be about its calling in this area? Then lastly, are we willing to fulfill our mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ who vote, consume, and volunteer in ways that correct the evil and enhance the good in globalization? So this is who we are, not only as individuals generally, not only as people who are part of the church, but as people who are making disciples. What kind of disciples are we making? And how will they be impacted by globalization, and how will they in turn impact it? So I'm going to give you some simpler questions that just help us again to apply. How are you and your family affected by globalization? As you learn about it, what do you think the impacts are? How is your church and ministry affected by globalization? How is your local community affected? How is your society and your country affected? How are your neighbors around the world affected? And taking stewardship seriously, what is in your power to ensure that those effects are as positive as possible? You don't have to answer these questions, but again, let them inform you and shape you and guide you as you take on the prompt for this week. Thank you.